Every student deserves a second chance, part 1. Every student deserves a second chance. All right, children, let's get started for the day. I look out over my current class, 13 children ready to learn and move on to the next phase. My job was to get them ready for what comes after they leave the classroom. I sighed. They were clearly unprepared. Another wonderful day at St. Matilda's Home for Troubled Children. I had my work cut out for me. Today's lesson will be on empathy. Has anyone ever heard that term? One student nodded. Very good, Madison. What do you think empathy is? Silence. Empathy is being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes to understand what they're feeling. For example, if you see someone who looks sad, maybe you can remember a time when you were sad and understand what they're going through. Does that make sense? 13 children nodded. A burst of laughter interrupted, and I looked over to see the source. It was them. The other class we had to share the room with. 13 juvenile delinquents, all guilty of crimes, theft, assault, that promised even more depravity as they grew older. There was nothing at all redeeming about them. I shuddered to think of the damage and suffering they would cause later in life. Find out what happens next in part 2. St. Matilda's motto was, "Every child deserves a second chance." Not for the first time, I wondered if that was really true. You see those children across the room? They're what happens when you have no empathy, when you give no thought to the feelings or suffering of others. You don't want to turn out like them, do you? 13 children shook their heads. Good. I know that you have a bright future ahead of you. Let's move on to the next lesson. The day proceeded with other subjects. I followed my lesson plan precisely to maximize their learning in the time available. We covered the basics, math, English, history, as well as key skills like the basics of fine muscle coordination and how to integrate into a new environment. After a couple of hours, we were nearing the end of the morning session. Find out what happens next in part 3. Suddenly I heard a thunk and an exclamation. I looked to the other side of the shared classroom. The teacher was standing there, rubbing the back of his head, with a notebook on the ground and several students snickering. The teacher looked out at his class, furious. "Which one of you did that?" "I think the notebook just flew across the room by itself, Mr. Wilkins," said one of the students. The rest all tried unsuccessfully to keep straight faces. A few covered their mouths to hide their laughing. Find out what happens next in part 4. The teacher looked out at them. "Since you find it so funny, you can all laugh together in detention." At that, they all started laughing harder. "Can you believe he expects us to come to detention?" one student asked. "What exactly is he going to do?" replied another. "Loser," mocked the first, not caring that the teacher could hear him. The teacher stood there, apoplectic but knowing the school wouldn't support any further punishment. The students were considered too valuable for St. Matilda's to do anything about it. In time, they would learn. A few weeks later, I stood at the front of my classroom, looking out over the innocent souls before me. I started to get nostalgic. Today was my class's graduation day. I looked at them, knowing I would never see them like this again. Congratulations on the year you've had. It's been my pleasure and honor to teach each of you, and I want you to know how proud I am of you all. I know we won't be together again exactly like this, but I can't wait to see what you all do in the future. You make me so proud. I love you all. Find out what happens next in part 5. Then I looked over at the class with which we shared the room. 13 juvenile delinquents, laughing and blabbering with no teacher in the room, like nothing they'd done had any consequence, and they hadn't learned a thing. I looked at my students and remained silent, waiting. They all watched the other class make fools of themselves. Then the bell rang. Now. All 13 of my students turned to face the other class, standing completely still. Then there was a blur of movement, swift and certain, as each student shimmered and dove into its counterpart body on the other side of the room. Find out what happens next in part 6. The other students jerked as if physically attacked, their eyes going wide as they sensed something wrong, but too late, far too late. Then they thrashed like marionettes on a string and collapsed. When the bodies rose again, they moved awkwardly as if walking for the first time. Then they turned as one and looked at me. "Good job, class. I'm proud of you. Go and live your new lives." They looked at me as one and said, "Thank you, Miss Percy," before walking out into the sunlight. I stared after them. A new class, moving on to take its place in the world. It always brought a tear to my eye, every time. Follow for more horror stories.